When the studio lights dimmed that October night in 1988, nobody knew they were about to witness the greatest unrehearsed vocal performance in music history. What started as a simple warm-up between two friends would become the legendary battle that changed everything. Before you hear this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever heard Whitney and Michael sing together? Because what happened that night will blow your mind. It was October 15th, 1988, and Whitney Houston was at the absolute peak of her powers. Her second album had just gone diamond. I Wanna Dance with Somebody was still dominating radio, and every note that came out of her mouth seemed touched by heaven itself. She was in Studio A at Record Plant in Los Angeles, putting finishing touches on tracks that would become some of her most beloved songs. Three doors down, in Studio D, Michael Jackson was working on what would eventually become Dangerous. The king of pop was in his element, perfecting every single detail of his upcoming album with the same obsessive precision that had made Thriller the best-selling album of all time. Neither knew the other was there until Quincy Jones walked through the doors of Studio A with a mischievous smile that Whitney would remember for the rest of her life. "Whitney, honey," Quincy said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had guided both their careers. "There's someone I think you should meet properly." Whitney looked up from her music sheets, her eyebrows raised. She knew Quincy well enough to recognize when he was planning something. "Who's here, Q?" she asked, though part of her already suspected. "The king himself is three doors down, and I think it's time you two had a real conversation." What Whitney didn't know was that Michael had been asking about her all week. He'd heard her voice drifting through the hallways during her vocal exercises, and it had stopped him cold every single time. The purity, the power, the control. It was everything he respected about true vocal artistry. "She's really here?" Michael had asked Quincy earlier that day. The voice? That's what Michael called Whitney privately. Not Whitney Houston, the pop star, but simply the voice. It was his highest form of respect. When Whitney walked into Studio D, Michael was sitting at the piano, his signature fedora tilted slightly, fingers dancing across the keys. He looked up, and for a moment, two of music's greatest perfectionists just stared at each other. "So you're the one who's been making those incredible sounds down the hall," Michael said softly, his voice carrying that gentle tone he reserved for people he truly admired. Whitney smiled, suddenly feeling nervous in a way she hadn't experienced since her first recording session. "And you're the one who's been making my job harder by setting the bar so high." They both laughed and the tension melted. But what happened next would change both of their perspectives on their own abilities forever. Quincy, watching this mutual admiration with the satisfaction of a master chess player, decided to up the ante. "You know what? I've got an idea. Both of you are working on ballads tonight. Why don't you warm up together?" "Warm up together?" Whitney asked, though her eyes were already sparkling with interest. "Nothing formal," Quincy continued. "Just see what happens when greatness meets greatness." Michael stood up from the piano bench, extending his hand toward the keys. "Ladies first," he said with that shy smile that had charmed the world. Whitney approached the piano, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with pure musical excitement. She placed her fingers on the keys and began playing the opening chords to "Greatest Love of All." But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. As Whitney began to sing, Michael didn't just listen. He started adding harmonies, not competing, but supporting, creating layers of sound that transformed her solo performance into something otherworldly. His voice weaved around hers like silk, finding spaces in her melody that even she didn't know existed. The studio fell absolutely silent except for their voices. Engineers stopped adjusting levels. Assistants stopped shuffling papers. Even Quincy, who had heard it all in his decades in the music industry, stood frozen with tears in his eyes. But Whitney was just getting started. When she finished the first verse, she looked at Michael with a smile that said, "Your turn." Without missing a beat, Michael launched into "Man in the Mirror." But this time, Whitney became his harmony, her voice soaring above his in ways that made the song sound completely new. That's when something magical happened. The warm-up became a conversation, not with words but with pure vocal artistry. They started trading runs, each one pushing the other to new heights. Whitney would hit a note that seemed impossible, and Michael would answer with something equally stunning. Michael would create a vocal arrangement that defied logic, and Whitney would build on it until the entire studio seemed to vibrate with their combined power. For 20 minutes, they pushed each other in ways neither had ever experienced. It wasn't a competition, it was a collaboration between two artists who finally had someone who could match their dedication to perfection. What happened during those 20 minutes defied everything the music industry thought it knew about vocal performance. Whitney would start a run that seemed to climb impossibly high, her voice maintaining perfect clarity and power, even in the stratosphere of her range. Michael would listen, nod appreciatively, then respond with a vocal arrangement so intricate and rhythmically complex that it sounded like he was singing percussion and melody simultaneously. "I've never seen anything like the way they listened to each other," recalled background vocalist Saida Garrett, who was there that night. "Most singers, even great ones, they're waiting for their turn to shine. But Whitney and Michael, they were building something together." Whitney would leave space in her phrasing specifically for Michael to fill, and he would do the same for her. It was like watching two master architects design a cathedral together. The technical aspects of what they were doing left the professional musicians in the room stunned. Whitney was employing gospel techniques that most pop singers couldn't even attempt, melismatic runs that told entire emotional stories within single syllables. Meanwhile, Michael was demonstrating rhythmic vocal patterns that seemed to come from another dimension, his voice becoming a percussion instrument, a melody line, and a harmony section all at once. "Whitney's voice that night had this quality I'd never heard before," said Bruce Swedian, the legendary engineer. "Usually when singers push into their upper register like that, there's strain, there's effort you can hear. But with Michael there, responding to her, supporting her, it was like her voice found a freedom it had never had. And Michael, God, Michael was singing things that night that I know he'd never sung before and probably never sang again." The most remarkable moment came when they began improvising around "I Will Always Love You," a song Whitney would make famous years later in The Bodyguard, but which she was just beginning to explore in 1988. Michael had never heard her sing it before, but as she began the opening lines, he instinctively found a counter melody that elevated the entire song to a different level. "The hair on my arm stood up," remembered recording engineer Matt Forger. Whitney was singing this song like she was saying goodbye to someone she loved more than life itself, and Michael was singing it like he was promising to protect that love forever. Together, it became this conversation between two souls that was so intimate, I felt like I was eavesdropping on something sacred. But the most incredible moment was yet to come. Halfway through their impromptu session, they began singing "The Way You Make Me Feel," but Whitney transformed it into something soulful and gospel-influenced, while Michael maintained his pop sensibilities. The result was a version of the song that was simultaneously familiar and completely revolutionary. As they sang together, something shifted in the room. Everyone present realized they were witnessing something that would never happen again. Two once-in-a-generation voices, at the absolute peak of their powers, pushing each other to transcendent heights with no cameras rolling. No record deal pressures, just pure artistic expression. Seth Riggs, the vocal coach who was there that night, would later say, "In 30 years of working with singers, I've never heard anything like those 20 minutes. It was like watching Michelangelo and Da Vinci paint the same canvas." When they finally stopped, the studio remained silent for what felt like forever. Then slowly everyone began to applaud. Not the polite applause of industry professionals, but the kind of emotional response you have when you've witnessed something truly historic. Whitney and Michael looked at each other, both slightly out of breath, both with tears in their eyes. "That was," Whitney started. "I know," Michael finished. But here's what makes this story even more incredible and heartbreaking. None of it was recorded. The tape wasn't rolling. The equipment wasn't set up. It was just a warm-up session that turned into the greatest unrehearsed duet in music history, and the only record of it exists in the memories of the 12 people who were lucky enough to be in that room. "Why didn't you record it?" Whitney asked Quincy later. His answer would haunt music fans forever. "Some moments are too perfect to capture. They're meant to exist only in the moment. for the people who were there to witness them. But the impact of that night extended far beyond those 20 minutes. From that day forward, Whitney and Michael viewed each other not as competitors, but as kindred spirits. They understood each other's pursuit of perfection in ways no one else could. They'd found someone who demanded as much from themselves as they did. Michael called Whitney the next day. "Last night changed how I hear my own voice," he told her. "Singing with you showed me possibilities I didn't know existed." Whitney felt the same way. "For the first time in my career, I met someone who made me want to be better, not because I felt competitive, but because I felt inspired." Their friendship, which began with that vocal session, lasted until Michael's death in 2009. They would call each other before big performances, sharing vocal exercises and offering encouragement. When Whitney struggled with personal issues in later years, Michael was one of the few people who truly understood the pressure she was under. The depth of their connection went far beyond professional admiration. In 1991, when Whitney was preparing for her iconic Super Bowl performance of The Star-Spangled Banner, she called Michael in a panic the night before. "I can't do this, Michael," she told him. "What if I mess up? What if I don't hit that high note? The whole country will be watching." Michael's response became legendary among Whitney's inner circle. "Whitney, remember that night in the studio? Remember how your voice found places it had never been because mine was there with you? Tomorrow, when you sing for America, I'll be there with you. You won't be singing alone." The next day, Whitney delivered what many consider the greatest rendition of the national anthem in history. Afterwards, her first phone call wasn't to her manager, her record label, or even her family. It was to Michael. "Did you feel it?" she asked him. "Every note," he replied. "You weren't singing alone." This became their ritual. Before every major performance, they would connect, sometimes just for 30 seconds, sometimes for an hour, reminding each other of that night when they discovered they weren't alone in their pursuit of perfection. Only Michael knew what it was like to be expected to be perfect every single time you opened your mouth, Whitney confided to a close friend. He was the only person who understood that sometimes the gift feels like a burden. The influence of that single session rippled through both of their careers in ways the public never knew. Michael's vocal arrangements on Dangerous incorporated gospel-influenced runs that he'd learned by listening to Whitney that night. Whitney's performance style became more rhythmically complex, incorporating some of Michael's percussive vocal techniques into her live shows. The legend of that October night grew among those who were there. Bruce Swedian, the engineer, would tell the story at dinner parties for years. Background vocalists who witnessed it would describe it as a religious experience. Music journalists who heard about it secondhand would spend years trying to verify the details, but everyone who was actually there protected the story like a sacred secret. In 1993, when Whitney was working on the Bodyguard soundtrack, she called Michael. "I keep thinking about that night in the studio," she told him, "the way we pushed each other to places neither of us had been before. Every time I perform now, I hear your voice in my head, challenging me to do better," Michael replied. That conversation led to them discussing a potential collaboration, a real one, recorded and released. They spent months planning it, writing together over the phone, imagining how they could capture even a fraction of what had happened that magical night. But the collaboration never happened. Industry politics, scheduling conflicts, and the pressures of their individual careers kept getting in the way. It remains one of music's greatest what-ifs. The last time they spoke was just weeks before Michael's death. Whitney was going through her own struggles, but Michael called to check on her. "Remember that night in '88?" he asked her. "How could I forget? That was us at our purest. No matter what else happens, that's who we really are. That's our truth." Whitney treasured that conversation, especially after Michael's passing. At his memorial service, she wanted to perform, but she was too emotionally overwhelmed. Instead, she sat in the audience, listening to the tributes, remembering the night when they discovered they weren't alone in their pursuit of perfection. When Whitney passed away in 2012, one of her closest friends revealed that she kept a small cassette recorder on her nightstand. On it was a recording of her, humming some of the harmonies she and Michael had created that night, the only audio evidence that the legendary session ever happened. But there was something else on that tape that her friend discovered after Whitney's death. In between the hummed melodies, Whitney had recorded herself talking about that night. "People think Michael and I were competitors," her voice whispered on the recording. "But that night in '88, we became something else entirely. We became mirrors for each other's souls. When I sang with Michael, I heard my own voice the way God intended it to be heard. And I think, for those 20 minutes, Michael heard his voice the same way." The tape revealed something even more profound. Whitney had been working on a song called "When You Believe," which would later become her duet with Mariah Carey for The Prince of Egypt. But originally, she had written it thinking about that night with Michael, imagining what they could have created together if the world had been different. "I keep writing songs for Michael," her recorded voice continued, "songs that need his voice to be complete. I know we'll never record together. There's too much industry politics, too many people who profit from keeping us separate. But in my heart, every song I sing has a Michael Jackson harmony. He's still pushing me to be better, even when he's not in the room. Today, that 20-minute vocal session exists only in the memories of those who were there and in the stories they've carefully shared. But its impact on both artists was immeasurable. It reminded them why they fell in love with music in the first place and showed them that perfection isn't about competing with others. It's about inspiring each other to reach heights you never thought possible." The vocal battle between Whitney Houston and Michael Jackson never had a winner because it was never really a battle. It was a conversation between two artistic souls who found in each other the only person who truly understood what it meant to carry the weight of an once-in-a-generation gift. In the end, that might be the most beautiful part of this story. In a world that constantly pitted them against each other, they found a moment of pure artistic communion that transcended competition and became about something much more important: the shared pursuit of musical truth. If you enjoyed this incredible untold story, make sure to subscribe for more hidden moments from music history. Have you ever experienced a moment of pure artistic magic like Whitney and Michael did? Let me know in the comments below.